I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped outside and saw an empty driveway where my car should have been, because in our neighborhood, nothing ever disappeared, unless the HOA wanted it gone, and taped to my mailbox was a bright orange notice that read, HOA violation, vehicle removed at owner's expense, signed by none other than Linda Harper, the HOA president who treated our street like her personal kingdom, and as I stood there in my slippers at 6:30 a.m., neighbors' curtains slowly twitching open, I felt that familiar mix of anger and humiliation she seemed to enjoy inflicting on people, because this wasn't the first time Linda had gone after me, not since I politely questioned her at the last meeting about why her cousin's truck could park overnight, but my perfectly legal sedan suddenly violated community aesthetics. And as I read the fine amount, $480 plus daily storage, I realized this wasn't about rules, it was revenge. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Before we start, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? And what's your HOA horror story? Let's jump into today's episode. Because my car was parked exactly where it had been for 3 years, inside my own driveway, visible in at least 4 HOA-approved photos from previous newsletters. And yet somehow, overnight, it had become a problem, and while most people would panic or pay up, what Linda didn't know was that this morning was the worst possible morning for her little power trip. Because I wasn't just late for work, I was late for an appointment downtown with a city compliance officer who had insisted on meeting at my house first, a man named Mark who had been quietly renting the small blue house on the corner for the past 6 months. The same man Linda loved to ignore because renters don't get opinions. And as I was dialing the towing company number with shaking hands, a black city-issued SUV pulled up behind me, and Mark stepped out in a crisp jacket, looked at the empty driveway, then at the notice in my hand, and raised an eyebrow in a way that made my stomach drop, because before I could even explain, he said calmly, "Let me guess, HOA?" And when I nodded, he took the paper, read Linda's signature, and let out a slow breath that sounded more like disappointment than surprise. Then he said something that instantly changed the way I looked at that stupid orange notice. "That's interesting because this property is currently under preliminary review for selective enforcement complaints." And suddenly the gossip-hungry neighbors weren't just watching anymore. They were listening, because Mark didn't lower his voice when he added, "And towing a legally parked vehicle without prior notice is a serious violation." And right then my phone buzzed with a text from Linda herself that read, "This is what happens when you don't respect the board." And as I stared at those words, I realized she had no idea what she'd just started, because by trying to embarrass me publicly, she'd handed me something far more valuable than my car. A front row seat to the moment her little HOA empire began to crack. Linda's text was still glowing on my phone when Mark calmly asked if I had a copy of my HOA bylaws, and I almost laughed because, like most people, I'd stopped reading them after page 3 years ago, trusting common sense would be enough. But Linda thrived on the fact that nobody ever checked the fine print, and as we walked inside my house, he explained in a low, steady voice that his quiet rental was intentional because the city had received multiple anonymous complaints about our HOA for selective enforcement, intimidation, and improper fines. All patterns that only became clear when the board felt comfortable abusing the same homeowners repeatedly, and apparently my name had come up more than once, which suddenly made sense of the warning letters, the surprise inspections, and the way Linda always smiled just a little too hard whenever she handed me a violation notice. And while Mark reviewed the bylaws at my kitchen table, my phone kept buzzing with neighborhood gossip as Linda posted in the HOA group chat that my car had been lawfully removed, and that this was a reminder to everyone to respect community standards, followed by a few predictable thumbs-up reactions from her loyal circle, the same people who never seemed to get fined themselves. And when Mark finally looked up, his expression had changed, because right there in black and white was a clause stating that vehicles parked in private driveways could not be towed without a 72-hour written notice unless they blocked emergency access, which mine clearly hadn't. And when I showed him photos from my security camera proving the tow happened at 2:14 a.m., his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the way someone reacts when a theory is suddenly confirmed. And before I could ask what that meant for me, there was a sharp knock at the door, and standing there, arms crossed and lips pressed thin, was Linda herself, as if she could sense she was losing control of the narrative, and she didn't bother with pleasantries, instead announcing loudly that she was here to document further violations, her eyes darting past Mark as if he were invisible until he calmly stepped forward, introduced himself by full name and title, and watched the color drain from her face in real time. Because the confident HOA president who bullied retirees and single parents had no script for a city compliance officer standing inside a homeowner's living room, and she recovered quickly, forcing a smile and insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that the tow company must have jumped the gun. But Mark simply asked her to explain why she personally authorized the tow without notice, referencing the exact bylaw number, and the silence that followed was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat, because Linda opened her mouth, closed it, then tried to deflect by accusing me of being difficult and disrespectful to the board. And that's when Mark asked the question that changed everything. Can you provide documentation showing equal enforcement of this rule across all residents? And Linda laughed nervously, saying of course, before realizing she had just agreed to something she couldn't possibly prove, and as she turned to leave, muttering that lawyers would be involved, Mark looked at me and said quietly, "Don't worry about the car yet." And when I asked why, he replied, "Because what happens next will cost her a lot more than a towing fee." And outside I could already see neighbors gathering, whispering, sensing that for the first time Linda wasn't the one in control, and that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. By noon the entire neighborhood felt different, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. And from my front window, I watched Linda march door to door with her clipboard, performing confidence for an audience that was suddenly paying closer attention, while my phone kept lighting up with private messages from neighbors who had never spoken to me before, quietly asking if it was true that the city was investigating the HOA, and when I replied carefully, saying only that rules worked both ways, the responses shifted from curiosity to relief because it turned out Linda's reign hadn't just annoyed people, it had scared them. And as Mark made calls from my dining table, requesting enforcement records and financial disclosures, I learned that selective enforcement was just the surface, because over the past 2 years fines had tripled, but maintenance complaints mysteriously went unanswered, and the money trail led straight back to vendors connected to Linda's family, which explained why her cousin's landscaping company had exclusive contracts while half the street dealt with dying trees and cracked sidewalks. And just as this realization settled in, the towing company finally called back, informing me that my car was being held until the HOA released it, a statement that made Mark smile thinly as he asked for the company's compliance officer, because authorizing a tow without proper notice didn't just violate HOA rules, it violated municipal code, and while he handled that, Linda took to social media, posting long rants about ungrateful homeowners and outside interference, framing herself as the victim of a smear campaign. But the comments didn't go the way she expected because people started asking questions, tagging city pages, and sharing their own stories of surprise fines and threatening letters, and by the time Linda realized the comment section wasn't under her control, screenshots were already circulating, including one where she admitted she didn't need paperwork to know who was breaking the rules, a sentence that might as well have been a confession. And later that afternoon, as a small crowd gathered near the clubhouse pretending to walk dogs while actually watching her every move, Mark informed me that the city had placed a temporary hold on all HOA enforcement actions pending review, meaning no fines, no tows, no threats, and when Linda stormed into the emergency board meeting she had hastily called, her voice echoed through the open windows as she demanded loyalty and accused unnamed residents of sabotage. But this time, the silence she faced wasn't fear. It was hesitation, because even her usual supporters looked unsure, glancing at their phones where messages from neighbors and links to city regulations were spreading faster than she could shut them down. And when the meeting ended abruptly with no votes and no resolutions, Linda left through the side door, avoiding eye contact, while Mark leaned back in his chair and said something that made my stomach flip again. "Tomorrow we request the financials." and suddenly my missing car felt like a minor inconvenience because I could sense that what Linda was really about to lose wasn't authority or money, but the illusion that she'd ever been untouchable in the first place. The next morning started with an email blast from the HOA marked urgent, written in Linda's usual aggressive tone, insisting that all board records were confidential and that any attempt to access them without permission would be considered harassment, which was ironic considering the city's formal request for those same records had been sent an hour earlier, and as Mark forwarded me the compliance notice, I could almost picture Linda reading it, realizing her intimidation tactics no longer worked, because by mid-morning, city officials arrived at the clubhouse with clipboards and neutral expressions, drawing curious neighbors out onto their porches, and while Linda hovered nearby, pretending to be helpful, the officials asked for invoices, contracts, and enforcement logs, the kind of boring paperwork she never thought anyone would actually check. And inside the clubhouse, the mood shifted as boxes were pulled from storage, revealing disorganized files, missing receipts, and handwritten notes that raised more questions than answers, and when one official asked why several landscaping payments were made to a company registered under Linda's cousin's home address, her confident explanations began to crack, replaced by defensive jokes and sharp comments about bureaucracy, but the more she talked, the worse it sounded, and outside, word spread fast, with neighbors whispering about the fines they'd paid, suddenly wondering where that money had gone, and when the towing company released my car without charge after receiving a call from the city, it felt less like a victory and more like confirmation that Linda's authority was evaporating in real time, because instead of celebrating, I watched her from across the street as she paced on the clubhouse steps, phone pressed to her ear, voice rising in panic. And later that afternoon, another message appeared in the HOA group chat, this time claiming the investigation was routine and that the board had nothing to hide. But the replies told a different story, with residents openly demanding transparency and asking why certain families never seemed to get fined, questions that Linda answered with silence, and when Mark returned from the clubhouse with a tight expression, he told me the city had found enough discrepancies to escalate the review, meaning subpoenas, audits, and possibly personal liability for board members who approved improper spending, and as the sun set, casting long shadows across the street Linda once ruled, I realized the power dynamic had fully flipped, because neighbors who used to avoid her were now comparing notes, sharing documents, and preparing statements, while Linda stayed inside her house with the lights off, a stark contrast to the woman who once patrolled the block like a sheriff, and when Mark said quietly, "She's going to try something desperate next," I believed him, because people who build their identity on control rarely accept losing it without a fight. Mark's warning proved true sooner than I expected, because just before midnight my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA portal stating that I had been issued 3 new violations for exterior lighting, trash bin visibility, and unapproved door hardware, all time-stamped within the same 5-minute window. A clear attempt to reassert control while hoping no one would notice. But instead of panic, I felt a strange calm, because desperation always leaves fingerprints, and when I forwarded the notices to Mark, he replied almost instantly with a single line, "Document everything." And by sunrise, neighbors were already comparing screenshots, realizing they'd received similar surprise violations overnight, all targeting the same small group of residents who had spoken up during the investigation, which turned Linda's secret punishment into public evidence of retaliation. And when she followed up with a smug group message reminding everyone that the board still has authority, it backfired spectacularly, because residents began replying in the open chat, citing city codes, linking screenshots, and asking why violations were being issued during an active enforcement freeze. And as Linda's responses grew shorter and more defensive, Mark confirmed what we all suspected, that retaliation during an investigation was itself a serious violation, one that could personally implicate her, and by mid-morning the city issued a cease and desist order to the HOA, freezing all board actions and requiring immediate cooperation, a document Linda tried to spin as a temporary misunderstanding. But the tone of the letter made it clear this was no longer procedural, it was disciplinary, and as neighbors gathered in small groups along the sidewalk, openly discussing fines they wanted refunded and rules they wanted reviewed, I saw something shift that had nothing to do with paperwork, because fear was gone, replaced by confidence. And when Linda finally stepped outside to confront the growing crowd, her usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by strained smiles and rehearsed lines about unity and patience. But no one interrupted her, no one argued, they simply watched, waiting. And that silence rattled her more than shouting ever could, because when Mark arrived and informed her that the city would be conducting individual interviews with residents starting the next day, her composure cracked, and for the first time since I'd known her, Linda looked small, not because she'd been defeated yet, but because she could feel it coming. And as she retreated back into her house, door closing softly behind her, I understood that this fight had moved past fines and tows, because the neighborhood wasn't just reclaiming its rights anymore, it was reclaiming its voice. And whatever happened next was going to be impossible for her to control. The interviews began the next morning, and instead of the quiet, orderly process Linda had predicted, the city's presence turned the neighborhood into a slow-burning courtroom, with residents lining up on sidewalks, clutching folders, phones, and years of pent-up frustration. And as each person returned from their meeting, the looks on their faces said more than words ever could, because stories started overlapping in ways that made patterns impossible to ignore. Surprise fines issued right after disagreements, warnings that magically disappeared for certain households, and payments demanded without receipts. And when my turn came, I laid everything out, from the first warning letter to the midnight violations, watching the investigator's pen pause more than once as she asked careful follow-up questions, the kind that suggested she already knew the answers. And outside, Linda's house remained dark and quiet, blinds drawn even as city vehicles parked openly along the street, a silence that felt deliberate until a rumor spread that she'd contacted a lawyer overnight, claiming harassment and bias, a move that might have worked weeks earlier, but now only added to the record because by afternoon the HOA bank accounts were frozen pending audit, something Linda learned about the hard way when her payment to the landscaping company bounced, triggering a cascade of automated alerts. And as that news spread, neighbors began to realize just how deeply she'd entangled personal interests with community funds. And when the city posted a public notice of the investigation on the community board near the mailbox cluster, it felt like a line being drawn in permanent ink, and Linda finally emerged, phone in hand, demanding to know who had turned everyone against her. But the question landed flat because no one answered, not out of fear, but because the truth was obvious. And when Mark arrived with another city official and informed her that the board would be temporarily suspended, pending the outcome of the audit, the color drained from her face, her voice rising as she protested that this was unfair, that she'd done everything for this community. But the official simply replied that doing everything included following the law, and as Linda argued, gesturing wildly at neighbors who now stood openly watching, I realized the real punishment wasn't the suspension or the investigation, it was the exposure, because the authority she relied on only existed as long as people believed in it. And standing there in the open, stripped of control, she was just another resident facing consequences. And as the officials left, Mark leaned toward me and said quietly, "Tomorrow, the financial report goes public." And the way he said it made it clear that whatever secrets Linda thought she could bury were about to surface for everyone to see. The financial report dropped the next afternoon like a shockwave, quietly uploaded to the city portal but shared across the neighborhood within minutes, and as people scrolled through pages of numbers, highlighted discrepancies and familiar names tied to inflated contracts, the last pieces finally clicked into place because it wasn't just mismanagement, it was a pattern of self-serving decisions disguised as community leadership. And when residents noticed how often Linda's cousin's company appeared next to vague descriptions like emergency maintenance and special enforcement support, the outrage was immediate but controlled, not loud or chaotic, just focused. And by the time Linda attempted one final email claiming the report was misleading, no one responded, because arguments require an audience, and hers had moved on, and that silence carried into the emergency meeting called by the city, where Linda arrived flanked by legal counsel but left early, face tight and unreadable, after officials announced formal findings of selective enforcement, retaliation, and improper use of HOA funds, along with a recommendation for restitution and permanent removal from the board. And as the meeting ended, neighbors didn't cheer or clap. They simply nodded to one another, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that comes from shared relief. and over the following weeks fines were refunded, contracts were rebid transparently, and an interim board was formed with strict oversight, restoring a sense of normalcy that felt almost strange after years of tension. And one evening, as I parked my car back in my driveway, exactly where it had always belonged, I saw Mark loading boxes into his SUV, his role finished, and when I thanked him, he smiled and said the same thing he'd told me on the first day, that rules only matter when people are willing to question how they're enforced. And as his car disappeared down the street, I looked around at a neighborhood that felt lighter, quieter, and more honest, knowing the story would be retold in pieces, simplified and exaggerated over time, but I'd remember it clearly, not as the moment my car was towed, but as the moment an entire community stopped being afraid to look back at the person who thought she owned it, and finally said, without shouting, without drama, just by refusing to look away, that her control ended there. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.